Chapter 18. Andy made his way to the police station as fast as his legs could carry him. He might have hailed a cab or even gone back home to collect his car, but there was an energy inside him that he needed to burn off before he got there. If Daniel Godfrey was stood right in front of him there and then, he'd rip the guy's head off. The walk allowed him to process things in his head. It's Mark's money. He can make the decision on what goes on with it. I'm financially secure. But the opposite side still burned within him. The peace he found with the above comments disappeared with the thoughts below. Why should Daniel Godfrey have it? It should stay in the family. Mark has been conned. And it was the potential of the last thought that burned hottest inside of him. If Mark had been duped, then it was up to Andy to uncover and repair the injustice. And that would start with confronting Daniel Godfrey. That man had a great deal to answer for. But it was all on a whim. What were the chances of Daniel Godfrey being there when he arrived? What were the odds of him even recognizing the guy? He'd asked Barry to send him some pictures of the man, something that would help him find the bastard. But Andy knew it was a long shot. Not only that, but it was also a long game. Andy was prepared. He had nothing else to live for but preserving his brother's wealth. As Andy reached the police station, he checked his phone for the images Barry, the IFA, had sent him. They were from the internet. Some images of Daniel Godfrey, or Dan as he called himself on social media. Armed with the images, he would know who Dan Godfrey was and be able to have it out with him. Most people didn't like to air their dirty laundry in public. Andy wasn't like that. And, at any rate, he didn't think it was his dirty laundry. It was Godfrey's. Looking down at his phone and then up at the steps of the police station, Andy couldn't quite believe his eyes. The man who he came to see, the man who he thought it might prove difficult to track down, was there, looking up at the sky as though he was adjusting to the light. "Oi! Godfrey! Get over here, you bastard!" Daniel Godfrey considered running, but where would he run to? Where was safer than the police station steps? "What?" he responded, standing his ground and tensing his muscles like it was a necessity in this situation. The guy looked tiny, but as he got closer, Godfrey realized that he might have been short, but made up for it in muscle. "You conning git! You might have pulled the wool over my brother's eyes, but you don't fool me. I'll take you to the fucking cleaners over this. Mark my words!" By now, Andy was running. There were a few bystanders alerted by the shouting and running, but none from inside the police station. Again, Godfrey considered running but thought better of it. He'd been chased and shouted at many times before. It was water off a duck's back. But this time, with the eyes of the police burning a hole in the back of his neck, it felt different. He felt guilty. He'd run away a few times before, too. Usually the boyfriends or husbands of women he'd charmed. Better to get out of there than stand that one down. When passion took over, there was no winner. "What's your problem? I don't even know your brother. Fucking idiot!" There Dan went, back to his old self. He felt confidence rush through his veins and the feelings of guilt dissipated. He was ready for an argument. He loved them. Godfrey had a boss when he worked in a supermarket that would keep a diary of when he should bawl out a team member. He would look and say, "It's Tuesday, time to have a go at Paul," and then proceed to scream and shout at Paul for some misdemeanor that was either real, historic, or made up. Godfrey watched him cheerfully tick it off in his diary and move on with his day. Godfrey liked this tactic, but not always Paul on a Tuesday. That was too obvious. Keep them on their toes. Keep them guessing. "Mark McManus, a better man than you. He has put all his trust in you, put all his money in you. What were you thinking? Do you even have a conscience? Listen, I'm sorry about your brother. Sorry? What for? For his death, for your loss. But you aren't sorry that you fleeced him dry. You aren't sorry that he left every penny he had to you." Daniel Godfrey stopped in his tracks. Until that point, he felt like an argument. But now he felt like laughing. He felt like all his Christmases had come at once. Could it really be true? Could he have all the money? It would certainly help keep the wolves at bay, that was for sure. Holding back his laughter, his glee, Godfrey held out his hand as a peace offering to Mark's brother. That was never going to be accepted. Andy swiped his hand away and aimed a punch at the ribs of the man who had persuaded his brother to give up all his money. Godfrey sidestepped it and offered a push in return. Not wanting to escalate the situation, he wanted to just get the man away. And he had the higher ground. Andy came back again, this time aiming for the ankles of the man stood above him. That way, the higher ground would mean nothing. Andy grabbed one ankle, then followed with the other and pulled with all his might. Godfrey landed with a bump, his ribs bouncing off 2 concrete steps at the same time, the wind disappearing from his lungs. Andy straddled the other man and started raining blows down on his shoulder, even though he targeted the side of his head. Andy sat up and took a deep breath. The man he was sat on top of was covering his head with his hands, raising his shoulder to blunt the attack. Andy couldn't help but feel that this guy had been hit before, more than once. As Andy leant forward to renew his attack, he felt an arm under each shoulder. "Not here, Andy, not now," Ash said, as he and Augustine picked the guy off Daniel Godfrey. Expecting a backlash from Godfrey, Ash handed Andy to Gus and stepped between the 2 men. But Daniel Godfrey was having none of it. He turned and ran. "Andy, we know you're hurting, but that's not the man who killed your brother," Ash explained. "Are you sure about that? Do you know what he did?" Andy screamed at the top of his lungs. Ash looked at him, scolding with his eyes the same way you do a child. Andy calmed. "Let's go inside and talk about this," Augustine said. The 3 men went and took a seat in the nearest available room. "Interview room 1 is taken," Augustine shouted over to the desk sergeant as they walked inside. The desk sergeant rolled his eyes and made a note. Better to just let them get on with it, rather than argue with the detective. They had work to do. "What's all this about, Andy?" Ash asked. "Grief comes out in so many ways. Believe me, this isn't a good one." "This isn't grief. This is revenge." "Revenge for what?" Ash queried. "You know what they say in most criminal investigations, don't you? Follow the money. And if you follow the money with this one, there's only one place you end up. That's squarely at the door of Daniel Godfrey." "I'm sorry, Andy. I don't follow." "All of Mark's money. All of it. It's gone to Daniel Godfrey. The savings, the investments, the money in the will. I've seen it." "We've spoken to Daniel, and he's offered to give us a sample of his DNA. We're seeing if he's a match for what was found at the scene. My guess is that he wasn't there," Ash replied, looking at Augustine for approval. It was implicit. "Well, if it wasn't him, then he paid someone to do it. He's not short of cash now that my brother is dead." This does not put a different light on things, and we will be speaking to Daniel Godfrey again. But let us eliminate him from the scene and work from there. If you can get us a copy of Mark's will, then we've got something concrete to go on. Augustine spoke, ending the conversation. Andy nodded. He would get the will, but he would also watch Daniel Godfrey like a hawk. The man had some explaining to do. If it wasn't to the police, then it would be to him.